Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Duel Stories was America's first Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game, releasing on the Gameboy Color one day before Forbidden Memories on the PS1. Notably, Dark Duel Stories was the third game in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters series of Game Boy games in Japan, although there it has the much more badass name, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters III Tri-God Holy Advent, which is of course a follow-up to Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters II Dark Duel Stories. Wait, what? Dark Duel Stories, kinda adapts the card game, covering through Spell Ruler, the set formerly known as Magic Ruler, but Magic the Gathering got mad, which is the third set in America, and like the 7th or 9th or something in Japan because they typically have more frequent, smaller set releases. And even though the game released in 2000 in Japan and 2002 here, the game came out alongside Magic Ruler both times, lining it up as a nice bit of brand synergy. Dark Duel Stories bears a very loose resemblance to the card game, in the sense that you put monsters on the field and attack, mostly, and not in most of the other ways, despite its release alongside Magic Ruler, which turned Yu-Gi-Oh! Into a realish game you might kind of enjoy playing, and none of them work quite like you'd probably want, most of the time. While the TCG deck building process at the time was still basically sword attack high-low, Summon Skull Turbo plus a handful of good flip monsters, at least putting Summon Skull out on the field felt good. While big numbers are still necessary in this game, the attribute system is a disaster for deck building. Had it not been for this system, you could at least build around a field spell. Every monster has an attribute, although instead of the 7 in the TCG, the game grabs all the manga ones, and these attributes all have strengths and weaknesses against each other, forming two kinda confounding circles. The less confusing consists of fire beating forest beating wind, wind beating earth beating thunder, thunder beating water, and water beating fire. Most of these kinda make sense, and I had a feel for this circle by the end, with occasional slip-ups on the forest, winds, and earths. The other one is basically arbitrary. Shadow beats light, light beats fiend, fiend beats dreams, and dreams beats shadow. These could all basically be arranged in any order and make about as much sense as it does now. It gets rather confusing in the heat of a duel. Lastly, Divine has no weaknesses or strengths. Good luck getting any Divine cards though. This attribute weakness system might not have been so bad if the benefit to the stronger one was like a 500 attack boost or something. If anything, it would encourage tribute summoning where you could offset the disadvantage with large numbers. Instead, the weak attribute monster dies instantly. Tributing feels bad because it's liable to die to a 300 attack shit monster with a positive attribute, discourages trying to build a deck along attribute lines backed up by field spells and equips because you get walled out by any random strong attribute monster regardless of its stats, and you're more or less encouraged to play some bizarre monster mash deck of assorted attributes with no strategy and hope that you get the attributes you need when you need them. Okay, it's a mess, but surely everything else works, right? I mean, the game has face down attack position. Take a guess. In fact, this is the only position from which effects can be activated, and doing so prevents you from attacking with said monster. No flip effects, no reactive effects. You use the effect once the turn you summon a monster, and then you get attacked. There's probably some situation where an effect helps you win, but the amount of times that is versus the amount of times that big number beat does is probably fairly small, especially when effects have been narrowed down to ones we can program on a Game Boy card, ranging from baffling to bad, especially given their abstract descriptions. Time Wizard specifies that it turns Baby Dragon into Thousand Dragon, which I assume means it lacks the situational field nuke, because I have no idea why you'd make that one the bonus Easter egg effect. Flame Swordsman simply specifies Dinosaur Hunter with Fire Sword. One can only imagine what that may do. Mammoth Graveyard drains the power of opposing monsters by some nondescript amount. Spirit of the Book summons Bukus to open field areas. There's no card in this game called Buku, so I have no clue what that is. And Fire Reaper can deal a staggering 50 burn damage at the cost of not attacking. There's a small handful of ones that are probably worth it, namely Kairyu Shin, which can cheat out Umi, and Relinquish and Thousand Eye Restrict, which steal monsters. But having beaten the game, I can say kinda definitively, big numbers and ending games quickly is key when the power spells start to come out. Effects are bad, but what about the fusions and rituals? At least you get a special summon and more numbers. They're also broken. To be kinda fair to the fusions, not needing polymerization is nice. You kinda just mash monsters together and they might fuse, and if they do, Even if you stumble into a generic one, if you fuse in the hand, you still need to summon it, and if your fusion attempt fails, you lose a card and your ability to summon for the turn, and at that point, you're dead. If you stack a card on a monster on the field, you might be able to fuse, or you may just delete your old monster. Also, since fusion monsters made on the field are summoned face up by default, they can't use their effects, ever. You just need to get the standalone version of Thousand Eye Restrict and Raw Dog it if you want that. Also, monsters can't attack the turn they're fusion summoned. The overwhelming disadvantage you get from failing to fuse is almost as terrible as the overwhelming disadvantage you get when you actually manage it. That big ass fusion monster you just made is getting power carded instantly. Rituals also struggle a bit. The ritual spells demand extremely specific materials, up to 3 of them, and those materials need to be on the field. There's a ritual to cheat out Blue Eyes Ultimate, but good luck assembling all 3 Blue Eyes in a game with no searching, graveyard recovery or a graveyard period, and one draw card that is of course limited, Pot of Greed. And you have to find the ritual spell, all while dodging constant power cards. Where fusion may occasionally make a big enough wall as a desperation move, ritual will never have your back. Relative to everything else going on, spells work fairly well. They were called magic back then, but I'm not going to do that. They typically do a thing, and while that thing is usually number go up, they actually do what they're meant to. The bigger problem is that you probably wouldn't want to. Field spells and equip spells suffer from the need to use a hodgepodge of attributes, life point gain doesn't help you win, burn deals piss amounts of damage, and your opponent's incapable of dying to burn. You still need to attack them again to actually finish the game. The Destroy X monster type is very situational, and I'm not even sure what some cards do. I attempted to use Kunai with Chain to no avail, even though it costs 200 points to put in your deck, and never managed to get it to do a single thing. Magical Labyrinth does, and I quote, "structure of maze on field revealed," which is a sentence that elicits no sense of understanding, and Harpy's Feather Duster, one of the best cards ever made, is functionally useless because the AI will never set spells or traps. The spells you would want to use are all limited to one, and they're power spells for a reason. Brain Control steals the monster for one turn, Change of Heart does it permanently, which makes it far and away the best card in the game. Dark Hole, Raigeki, Pot of Greed, Swords of Revealing Light, which doesn't linger on the field and therefore always stalls exactly 3 turns. All these cards are insane in your hands and horrifying in your opponent's. Your opponent does not have to follow the limited list like you do, which is unhinged. Activating swords once is already game winning, twice in a row is basically unstoppable. There's one big problem though, duel level. Every time you beat an opponent, your duel level raises by 5, although you could hypothetically gain 20 per duel if you had a real-life friend to job to you. And each card has a cost. Your deck needs exactly 40 cards and it costs less than your duel level. It took us several straight hours of grinding one of the easiest fights in the game to hit the 255 levels to cram Change of Heart in the deck, and it won us a lot of games after, but between the constantly increasing costs of better monsters and the absurd cost of the power cards, they're basically inaccessible. Maybe one per deck if you're willing to grind, but it's just so fucking painful to get to that point. Oh yeah, Monster Reborn also dodged being in this game. Kinda nuts that the graveyard is just not a mechanic. The game doesn't remember what's in the grave, it doesn't care. There's no way to get them back, they're just gone. Thankfully the good traps cost way less, all 2 of them. Acid Trap Hole destroys any monster with 3000 attack or less on summon, and there are less good versions of this in every increment of 500. Widespread Ruin destroys a monster on attack declaration, and everything else does nothing, especially Fake Trap. Keep up the good work, buddy. Traps are more so weird in how prediction reliant even the good ones are. You can only set 1 trap a turn, it activates automatically in a scenario where its conditions are met, and if your opponent ends the turn without setting it off, it fizzles and dies. Even the seemingly infallible good traps lose to opponent sets and passes, so they're more recovery tools than actually defensive, although they come close enough to functioning that it's hard to complain. Playing cards is one set of messes, but it's notable that getting cards is just as bad. After each duel you get 1 card. The good ones in each character's drop tables tend to be below 1% drop rate, and even the bad ones max out at like 2.5% because the drop tables are so cluttered. With a password, Solomon will be unlocked and give you an additional card after every duel. He has a few power cards, but mostly just dumps shitty ritual spells on you or bad monsters. Although admittedly early on the extra monsters are a huge relief because your deck is going to be so narrow. Getting a card crucial for your strategy is hellish. One of the power spells or another is almost necessary to get over the finish line, and you need to grind out deck points too. How the game forces you to fight every character 5 times to even beat the game. Grinding is built into this game's DNA in an attempt to drag the game out as much as possible. The only way to get cards beyond the painful drops is a custom card maker, a bizarre and necessary system. After each duel you get a random card part, and if you have Solomon active he also gives you an additional one. And these top parts and bottom parts can be used to make new, horribly ugly and clunkily named monsters, many of which have good numbers, some 2k beaters, some 1900s with 16 defense, and so on. As you grind towards the end of the game, you'll very likely end up with a decent chunk of your deck made up of these things simply because they're better than the monsters of the day. They're ugly, but they make the game beatable. So this game is pretty bad. It's a massive grind where you tediously face bash Yugi over and over, fishing for power cards and to slowly climb in points. You can't play coherent decks thanks to the attribute system, and the final few opponents play full play sets of limited power cards, while you struggle to fit 1 into your deck. The early game is 500 attack normal monsters trading, and games drag on for 100 turns. The late game ends in 3 or 5 regardless of who wins. It's a mess. However, I can't lie. As the game progressed to the end, and as our deck of cards that were almost playable came together, and as we got a few playable traps and our Change of Heart, the game almost felt like Yu-Gi-Oh! Sometimes. Like if you squint really hard and it's dark and rainy. Nailing a huge monster with Change of Heart and getting it permanently felt hype as hell, or predicting a big push with Acid Trap Hole, or setting the 1800 defense custom, dealing some damage when they bump into it, flipping it up and then mauling their monster after. There's some true blue Yu-Gi-Oh moments mixed into this game, and I'd say the entire third tier was a decent bit of janky fun. It's hard to say a lot about the actual opponent's decks. The tier 1 guys dump sub 500 attack shitmons and maybe try to go for some stupid 2 tribute shit, and if they do, you'll probably lose at that point in the game. Tristan has no spells and no traps, but none of the opponents play traps. Just monsters with under 300 attack, which is embarrassing. Joey tries to make red eyes, but notably his Swordsman of Landstar's staggering 1200 defense is kinda big in the early game. Mai spams equips on Harpy Lady, which can be a touch intimidating before you figure out the attribute system. Mako tries to set up Umi to boost his deck of almost entirely waters, and Yugi plays random garbage to tribute for Dark Magician Girl, and Gaia, while keeping you from going too hard in on him via his 2 Dark Holes, which is a limited card by the way. The tier 2 guys have their fodder climb up to right around 1000 in stats. Typically, Esperoba tries to get out Jinzo. Effectless Jinzo. Rex plays dinosaurs, including the mediocre 1 tribute ones. Weevil only uses bugs and can hypothetically make perfectly ultimate Great Moth, which is silly. Seeker plays Stall Exodia, and by that I mean he has 3 heads and 1 of each limb and sets 1000 to 2000 defense cards to hold off while he draws very slowly. He's very miserable and slow to fight unless you add in cards specifically to hit his wall, namely Winds. Pandora plays a pretty straight Shadow deck boosted by Yami plus Dark Magician. It'd be kinda cool to do an attribute versus attribute thing in this game, fighting for field spell control, but alas. And Kaiba's the big numbers man. His base stat lines are fat and his attributes are all over. He's mostly balanced by a fairly large amount of tribute monsters that occasionally cause him to brick, especially the 2 tribute Blue Eyes, of which he has 3. But he's definitely the first custom card and dual level check in the game, kind of keeping you from advancing if you haven't spent a lot of time grinding. And he's definitely a bit of a wall if you're trying to sneak through off of random drops. In Tier 3, the game gets a bit weird. It abandons the modern day characters for the ancient Egypt characters that are mostly like minor manga characters that the anime skims, and they have more presence in some of these early video games, especially Forbidden Memories, which came out basically alongside this one. The base stat lines for these dudes is about 1500, which kinda sets the tone for how many customs you need. Simon was a game original character for this game, who was ported over to the manga later with the less silly name Sayamon, and who is for some reason called Paradox in this game, which I don't think he's ever been called anywhere else. And his deck is mostly just level 4 beatdown, which is admittedly the best strategy in this game, with the added addition of some power cards, Crush Card and Brain Control specifically. Seto, or Priest Seto, is Kaiba's ancient Egyptian equivalent in the same way Atem is Yugi's. His deck is standard Kaiba's, but stuffed with power cards, Change of Heart, Raigeki, Dark Hole, Megamorph. He's still prone to bricking, but also much more likely to beat Cancer in return. Ashizu plays a fairly familiar level 4 beatdown with all the Cancer power cards, notably adding 3 copies of Swords of Revealing Light to prevent you from playing the game, and using Cosmo Queen as a boss, which as a divine type is very hard to out, sans your own power cards. Lastly, Haishin, who is for some reason called Sly Sheen, who is entirely game original for this and Forbidden Memories, to serve as the big bad. His deck is very fiend heavy, but notably also includes several of the Toon cards for some reason, which feels kinda weird considering he lived 3000 years ago, well before the advent of cartoons. The final main boss is Dark Knight, a demon henchman summoned who ultimately betrays him. He uses all the power spells except the board wipes, has a 2200 attack level 4 in Jirai Gumo, but is ultimately held back by that being his one play. He plays some of the shittiest tribute monsters in the game, and Sans Gumo can be wiped with a 2k custom. Yami Yugi, who's the Pharaoh Atem, is the super boss, unlocked by clearing Dark Knight 5 times. Beyond the obligatory power spells, Atem plays one of each monster in his deck, meaning he plays more or less like you do, which is kind of a fun ending. A wild mix of attributes, power levels, costs. He's about as schizo as you're gonna be by the time you get to him, and it makes him surprisingly fun and fair, even if he can brick pretty hard on his magician cards. There are an additional 4 super bosses unlocked via code. I have no clue where these codes came from. I assume from a magazine or a guide or something, I don't know. Merrick Ishtar is one of the series' main villains. His deck is fiend heavy and plays big number beats and power cards, but with too many tribute monsters, which bricks him frequently. Yami Bakura, another big villain in the series, plays a very similar, albeit less bricky version of that deck, and one with much better attribute range to cover weaknesses. Shoddy plays the same deck, but arguably in its best form, minimizing bricks and having a 2 tribute divine monster to end you if you lack a power card, And finally, Nightmare, Dark Knight's true form, who plays a deck only marginally better than Tristan's, rocking 9 level 4 monsters and 13 tribute monsters, 7 of those being 2 tribute monsters. Even with his piles of power cards, specifically Brain Control and Change of Heart to generate tribute materials, he is a brick factory. I don't think he played a single card against us, and for the ultimate super boss, that's a fucking embarrassment. Dark Duel Stories definitely has a card game, video game presentation. The duel screen is about as form over function as you can get, giving you the information you need and not much else. To be fair, the stuff around the game part is pretty good. The character portraits are quite large, colorful, and expressive, and the card art is perhaps even more impressive, featuring tiny little recreations of card art, including a few that are reposed or otherwise edited for clarity, which is charming attention to detail. My biggest gripe is with the deck builder. Between the lack of visual elements, the shortened and butchered card names, and the arbitrary order that they're in, it's very hard to flip through 1,000 cards and find what you need at a glance. And needing to have less than 40 cards to add a card into your deck is another minor headache, since you have to plan deck points ahead of time to remove the proper cards, and then switch back and forth between menus over and over again to try to balance your deck out. And it's a bit absurd that you can only have one deck when even the Pokemon trading card game allows you to have like 10 or 12 or something. The music is passable. Each tier duelists have their own music, which means the tier 1 music will drive you insane when you get to the grind, over and over and over and over. However, most of the other music in the game is pretty decent. I wouldn't say any of it's stand out, but as far as basic dueling music goes, it's pretty okay, and the endgame music is pretty intense and decently good. I wouldn't say anything is standout, good or bad, it's just kind of there, but man, that tier 1 song it's burned into me now. Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Duel Stories struggles in basically any comparison you would want to make. It butchers the card game and removes most of its strategy and deck building potential. It looks bad in comparison to its contemporaries. Pokemon's card game, which I talked about in a different video, was crammed into a game that's shockingly accurate. And while Pokemon is definitely a less complex game in general, a lot of complex trainer effects were solved to make the game as complete as they possibly could make it, with only a few minor issues, and only a few years later, the Yu-Gi-Oh! GBA games would be condensing the entire card game down properly, give or take. Never mind what we have now with Master Duel. There's a novelty to it being so manga-centric, with all the quirks of adapting the weird shit there to some extent, and the kind of way that the attribute system reflects the way that bullshit would just be pulled out of people's asses to fix any problem. But the lack of a graveyard, the shallow pool of uninteresting effects, the weird quirks, and the grinding, man, so much grinding to even have a semblance of a deck make it so hard to squeeze fun out of the game. Towards the end, games occasionally get exciting, have some back and forth, some counterplay, but there's so much mindless, barely playing where you're just putting your big monster on the field and praying. It just pads out so much time between those good moments and ultimately never really feels like it's worth it. Ultimately, the game is a vague representation of Yu-Gi-Oh! In a time where you can now just load up Master Duel and play the whole ass game online for free. It's hard to suggest going back to this, and it's just like so clunky and weird. It's an interesting novelty, but it's not very good.